Good morning to one and all. Now we have to study the sexual reproduction in flowering plants. So commonly all the angiospermic plants they shows the flowering nature. So flowers are the major parts for sexual reproduction. Now we have to study the flower, how it helps for sexual reproduction. Among plant kingdom, angiosperms are the group of organisms which will involve flowers to fruits or flower to fruiting. So this sexual reproduction helps for the production of seeds and fruits. Without formation of these seeds, then further generation is not possible. For every cropping, we are using most of the seeds. For agriculture and horticulture purpose also, the seeds can performing a major role for agriculture farmers. So now we have to discuss commonly flowers are having different types of species or produces the different types of flowers. All these different types of the flowers they shows very attractive and fascinating and very good structures. So flowers are the symbols for the loving and happiness and griefness, like to express our feelings. For that purpose, the flowers are helping. When you have to observe a biologist who will study about the flowers, those flowers, their morphology and the embryological changes and the complete process of sexual reproduction, how it is occur in the organisms of flowering plants, that he can study by a botanist. Now let us study about the structure of a flower. Now the flower is the major part which will helps for the sexual reproduction. Now the flower which has composed of the parts, one we call it as sepals, and the petals, and the anther, and stigma. A flower has composed of four whorls that we have studied in first PUC. In this chapter we have to study in detail how a flowering plant can help for sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction we have studied in higher organisms, they shows the sexual reproduction, but in plants also they performing the sexual reproduction based on the presence of sexual parts. Those sexual parts nothing but of one, it is a stamens and the stigmas. So due to the presence of these stamens and stigmas, this sexual reproduction is occur in the bisexual flowers. Now we have to study how these flowers are present and what are the different parts present in the flowers. In these flowers, majorly different parts are present. Commonly we can see in one, it is sepals, petals, anther, stigma. These parts are present. These are the structure. Now we have to study the structure of the flower plant or flowering plant. These flower which has composed of different parts. Among these, the parts, those we called it as the sepals, and the petals. So these sepals and petals are helps for one, it is a protection function for the sepals which will protect the internal parts while the flower at the stage of bud condition. The petals, which are very attractive structures, which will help for pollination. For pollination purpose, these petals can attract the insects. Those insects can help for the pollination purpose. Now, the other parts we called it as a stamen. The another part we called it as the ovary, or also we called it as like these parts also we called it as the androecium and gynoecium. Androecium and gynoecium. Now, the parts called androecium is a male reproductive part, which will produce us the anthers. This anther has composed of which has the pollens, pollen sacs. In these pollen sacs, pollen grains are present. These pollen grains called as the male gametes. Now, the gynoecium is a female reproductive part. It is a female reproductive part and which has composed of the structures like stigma, style, ovary. Inside the ovary, ovules are present. Inside the ovules, the presence of egg cell. So egg is a female gamete. Egg is a female gamete. Now we have to study the androecium and gynoecium. We called it as the essential parts of the flowering plants because these two are involved for the sexual reproduction. That's why the androecium and the gynoecium we called it as the essential parts of the flowering plants. Whereas in case of the calyx, corolla, also we called it as the sepals and the petals, which are the non-essential parts of the flowering plants because they helps for protection function and helps for attraction of the insects to attract the insects for pollination. By the help of the pollination, the mechanism of pollination is a mechanism it's nothing but of the anthers anther to stigma. Pollen grains are passing, transferring. This mechanism we called it as the pollination. So here these anthers can produce us the numerous high concentration of the powdery like substance is nothing but of the pollen grains. Now the pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma region. This mechanism we called it as a pollination. Well, at the time of before fertilization, now we have to study called as pre-fertilization. During pre-fertilization structures, we can study all these are the external structures in a flowering plants. Those external structures we call it as morphology, the morphology of the flowering plants. This morphology of the flowering plants, commonly every angiospermic plant we can use. For these morphological structures we can find gymnosperms as well as the pteridophytes and the bryophytes, all we can use, but for sexual reproduction purpose we will give the priority to the plants we call it as the angiospermic plants. That's why in angiospermic plants the fascinating structure which helps for the sexual reproduction is nothing but of the flower. So this is an introduction class for the sexual reproduction in flowering plants. Thank you.